Ah yes, rituals. The mechanic for a long time was sort of the black sheep in Yu-Gi-Oh! Besides some decent output over time, there really wasn't a good ritual archetype that made the mechanic a viable threat. It's been around since 2002, with Relinquish being the first of its kind, and all in all that's a great start, but the mechanic was inherently flawed from the very beginning. Rituals are very resource heavy, and the price to pull it off successfully is steep. You need to have the ritual monster, the ritual spell both in hand, and a monster or monsters with the exact levels or ones that exceeded the ritual monster's level that you contribute to get it onto the field. More often than not, it was never really worth it because the effects rituals had, if any, were underwhelming at best. There were glimpses of greatness over the years with Demise and Gishkis having some meta impact, but a lot of love was given to fusions and eventually synchros, but rituals always felt like a mechanic Konami just forgot about, letting it rot and never realizing its full potential. However, in February 2015, that was all about to change with the release of the Secret Forces and Nekroz. Nekroz went on to become one of the few Tier 0 decks in the game's history. It revolutionized the mechanic, and much of what made Nekroz so good can still be felt in modern ritual design today. However, power creep wasn't too kind to Nekroz, and it's not the titan it once was. That's not to say the deck isn't good, because it most certainly is. With some generic support that's been released, the archetype is still fun and competitive, and with a good pilot, the deck is a monster to deal with. Honestly, with just a few pieces of dedicated support, the deck could potentially be a viable threat once again, and I believe that Konami will revisit the archetype in the future. With Gishki seeing a resurgence thanks to sprites and some bonkers new Gishki support, it's really only a matter of time before Nekroz sees the top tables once again, or at the very least a rogue contender. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the Nekroz archetype card by card, going over their effects, how the deck works, and the archetype's impact on the game as a whole. If you enjoy videos like these, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for future breakdowns like this. We'll start with the effect monsters, then move on to the ritual monsters and back row to top it off. First up is Shurit, strategist of the Nekroz. He's a level 3 warrior water type monster with 300 attack and 1800 defense with the following effect. If you ritual summon exactly one Nekroz ritual monster with a card effect that requires use of monsters, this card can be used as the entire requirement. If this card is tributed by a card effect, you can add one warrior Nekroz ritual monster from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Shurit, strategist of Nekroz, once per turn. Off the bat, we're starting off with a banger. Shurit makes up for so much of what makes rituals so hard to play in the first place, that being the tribute fodder for your rituals and the awful minus you typically have to go into when you play a ritual deck. He serves as the entire tribute and gets you access to essentially the entire archetype. More on that later, but just in this card you can see why Nekroz became the powerhouse it was. The card was so good it was eventually banned, but today you don't necessarily need to run Shurit with incantations and such, but I would recommend keeping him in the deck and experiment with the ratios. You won't always have access to exact levels, and Shurit more than makes up for it. Next up is Ariel, priestess of the Nekroz. She's a level 4 psychic type water monster with 1000 attack and 1800 defense with the following effect. Once per turn, you can reveal any number of Nekroz cards in your hand. Increase or reduce this card's level by the number of revealed cards until the end of this turn. If this card is tributed by a card effect, you can add one Nekroz monster from your deck to your hand, except a ritual monster. You can only use this effect of Ariel, priestess of the Nekroz, once per turn. It's not good. The level modulation is cute because the higher level rituals don't like you using exact levels to summon them, but having you reveal what you have to your opponent and the search only giving you access to the Nekroz effect monsters is just not good enough to make this worth running. The only notable targets would be Shurit and maybe a couple of the other ones I'll mention here in a bit, but really she wasn't worth running when she came out, and certainly not today. Our next monster is Great Sorcerer of the Nekroz, a level 4 spellcaster type water monster with 1500 attack and 800 defense with the following effect. If this card is tributed by a card effect, you can add one spellcaster type Nekroz ritual monster from your deck to your hand. If this card is banished, you can send one Nekroz monster from your deck to the graveyard, except Great Sorcerer of the Nekroz. You can only use one Great Sorcerer of the Nekroz effect per turn and only once that turn. This card was pretty good at the time and allowed you to grab some of the archetype's best monsters from your deck. The graveyard dump when banished provides some utility in conjunction with some of the Nekroz ritual spells and could allow you to further your plays depending on what kind of hand you have. The card was typically ran at 1 back during its heyday, but nowadays you won't really be seeing him in any deck list. Next up is Dance Princess of the Nekroz, a level 4 spellcaster type water monster with 1600 attack and 800 defense with the following effect. Your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in response to the activation of a Nekroz ritual spell card. Nekroz Nekroz ritual monsters you control cannot be targeted by an opponent's card effects. If this card is tributed by a card effect, you can target one of your banished Nekroz monsters, except Dance Princess of the Nekroz, added to your hand. You can only use this effect of Dance Princess of the Nekroz once per turn. Dance Princess is one of the better non-ritual monsters of the archetype. The targeting protection she provides is nice, and making sure your opponent cannot react to your ritual spells is pretty good. Grabbing a banished Nekroz monster is awesome too, allowing you to continue your plays. Like Sorcerer, she really doesn't see much play outside of Duel Links. And like back in the day, if you decided to run her, I would keep her at 1. She's a decent card, but there is just much better options nowadays, so use her by preference. The next card is Exa, Enforcer of the Nekroz, a level 5 dragon-type water monster with 2000 attack and 1000 defense with the effect, if this card is tributed by a card effect, you can add one dragon-type Nekroz ritual monster from your deck to your hand. If this card is banished, you can target one of your banished Nekroz monsters, except this card, special summon that monster. You can only use one Exa, Enforcer of the Nekroz effect per turn, and only once that turn. This was okay back in 2015 when the archetype was at its peak. The dragon ritual monsters had some decent utility for the time, and the special summon when it's banished helped maintain some field presence when it went off. Like Dance Princess and Sorcerer, this was a decent one-of at the time, but you really won't be seeing him nowadays. I wouldn't recommend him anymore, but run it by preference. There's definitely a lot worse you could put into your deck. Now we're moving on to the awkward pendulum monsters. Zephyr Saber, Swordmaster of the Nekroz, is a level 4 spellcaster type water pendulum monster, scale 1 with 1500 attack and 800 defense with the pendulum effect. You cannot pendulum summon monsters except Nekroz and Zephyr monsters. This effect cannot be negated. His monster effect, you can tribute this card from your hand or face up from your side of the field. Tribute monsters from your hand or field, then ritual summon one Nekroz ritual monster from your hand whose level exactly equals the total levels of those monsters. You can only use this effect of Zephyr Saber, Swordmaster of the Nekroz once per turn. Needless to say, you can't pendulum summon ritual monsters, so this support is a little awkward. It's meant to be used in conjunction with the non-ritual monsters and Zephyrs, which doesn't really play nicely with the deck. This card, however, is actually not too bad with it being an alternative ritual spell. He was typically a side deck option rather than a main deck staple, but it's searchable, so it does have some utility if you're already used your ritual spells this turn and want to push a little further. The same can't be said though for the other pendulum monster, Zefraxa, Flame Beast of the Nekroz. It's a dragon-type fire pendulum monster, scale 7 with 2000 attack and 1000 defense with the same pendulum effect as Zephyr Saber and the monster effect. While this card is in your hand or graveyard, if a face-up Nekroz or Zephyr card or cards, except Zefraxa, Flame Beast of the Nekroz, is destroyed by a battle or card effect while in your monster zone or pendulum zone, you can special summon this card. You can only use this effect of Zefraxa, Flame Beast of the Nekroz once per turn. In terms of utility for Nekroz, this really isn't worth anything. Its effect isn't awful, but it's more of a Zephyr card than it is a Nekroz card, and you won't be running this in your Nekroz deck. Now, before I get into the actual ritual monsters, there's one card in particular I feel like I should mention that helped to make Nekroz the absolute threat that it was. Even to this day, the card is still banned, and that's probably for the best considering. Djinn, Releaser of Rituals, is a level 3 fiend-type dark monster with 1200 attack and 2000 defense with the following effect. When you ritual summon a monster, you can banish this card from your graveyard as one of the monsters required for the ritual summon. If a player ritual summons using this card, the other player cannot special summon while that ritual summon monster is face up on the field. I don't think I need to elaborate why this card is busted. Preventing your opponent from special summoning at all by just doing what you're going to do anyway, which is ritual summon, made this card an absolute menace. Duelists used to have a gentleman's agreement not to use this card when playing competitively. I kind of wish this card would come off the ban list just because of how bonkers good it is and the generic boost it could provide to ritual decks, but I can completely understand why it probably never will. At least not without some kind of errata. And with that out of the way, we're ready to move on to the meat and potatoes of this archetype, and that's the ritual monsters, followed by their excellent ritual spells. Now, the ritual monsters of Nekroz are based on a dual terminal synchro monster of the same name, with one exception. They tend to share similar effects, levels, and stat lines as the monster they are based on. Starting with the lowest level monster, we have Nekroz of Clausulus, which was based on Mistbird Clausulus. He's a level 3 warrior type water ritual monster with 1200 attack and 2300 defense with the following effect. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell, must be ritual summon. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Clausulus once per turn. The First effect, you can discard this card, add one Nekroz spell or trap from your deck to your hand. Second effect, as a quick effect, you can target one face-up monster on the field that was special summoned from the extra deck. Until the end of this turn, that target's attack becomes 0. Also, that target's effects are negated. With just Clausulus, we can see why Nekroz was so good and make up for the issues that ritual archetypes tend to have. With him, you can add any Nekroz spell or trap, of which there are no traps, from your deck to your hand, and while on the field, as a quick effect, can negate extra deck monsters' effects and make their attack 0. Everything about Clausulus is great and sets the stage for the other monsters to follow. In terms of ratios, you typically want to run him at 2. 3 tends to be too cloggy, and the ritual spells are not that difficult to dig out of your deck once they're out. Clausulus can be a dead draw since you can only get his discard effect once per turn. Otherwise, a great card. Next up is Nekroz of Unicorn, which is based off the fabled Unicorn. He's a level 4 spellcaster type water ritual monster with 2300 attack and 1000 defense with the following effect. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summon. You can discard this card, then target one Nekroz card in your graveyard, except Nekroz of Unicorn, add it to your hand. You can only use this effect of Nekroz of Unicorn once per turn. Negate the effects of face-up monsters on the field that were special summoned from the extra deck. Now, that's a powerful floodgate effect. So powerful that it spent nearly 5 years limited to 1 copy in the TCG until he was finally released on the June 2020 Forbidden and Limited list. It goes without saying that the extra deck is critical for 95% of decks, and Unicorn simply just shuts all of that off. Unicorn embodies the heart and soul of what made Nekroz such a monster in the first place, punishing your opponent for relying on the extra deck to make their plays. It was also amongst the easiest Nekroz to get onto the field, being level 4 and not having any summoning restrictions like some of the other monsters we'll talk about in a bit. Its discard effect is really solid as well, getting you back any Nekroz card you might need to further your plays, or a piece of protection to keep your board intact. It's a great card, and I wouldn't recommend running any less than 3 in any Nekroz build. Our next monster is Nekroz of Catastor, based on the Synchro monster Ally of Justice Catastor. He's a level 5 dragon type water ritual monster with 2200 attack and 1200 defense with the following effect. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using Nekroz of Catastor. You can discard this card, then target one Nekroz monster in your graveyard, special summon it. You can only use this effect of Nekroz of Catastor once per turn. At the start of the damage step, if a Nekroz monster you control battles an opponent's monster that was special summoned from the extra deck, destroy that monster. The first thing you notice about the level 5 and higher Nekroz ritual monsters is the summoning restriction where you can't use another copy of themselves or of a similar level. To me, this restriction is unnecessary, but I guess Konami thought it would make it too easy to get them onto the board. It's a bizarre trope of the higher level ritual monsters, but typically it doesn't matter and doesn't really come up anyway. As for Catastor himself, he's okay. It's a shame he can't revive any of the ritual monsters that were already successfully special summoned, but it's useful to get your Dance Princess, Shuret, or really whichever non-ritual monster you need to continue your plays. His on-field effect is pretty nice, giving it to all of your Nekroz monsters instead of it just being his own built-in effect. He was more prevalent during 2015, but you really won't be seeing him nowadays since a lot of modern Nekroz builds forego most of the non-ritual monsters, making his discard effect irrelevant. However, it's worth experimenting with in the more pure builds, and he's typically ran at 1. Next up is the poster child of the archetype, Nekroz of Brionek, based off of Brionek Dragon of the Ice Barrier. He's a level 6 warrior type water ritual monster with 2300 attack and 1400 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using Nekroz of Brionek. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Brionek once per turn. The first effect, you can discard this card, add one Nekroz monster from your deck to your hand, except Nekroz of Brionek. The second effect, you can target up to 2 face-up monsters on the field that were special summoned from the extra deck, shuffle them into the deck. Brionek is incredible, full stop. It can access every single card in the archetype, ritual spells included if you search Clausulus. He's also easy to dig out of the deck with cards like Preparation of Rites, and more recently, Incantations. In addition to his solid search effect, his on-field effect is bonkers. Bouncing your opponent's extra deck monsters is a super powerful form of removal to prevent floating. It's a shame it targets, but for what you're getting, it's typically not a big deal. Brionek was quickly semi-limited on the April 2015 Forbidden and Limited list, and eventually to limited status alongside Unicorn in November of that year. He was finally unlimited once again in January 2019. With Brionek being level 6, he actually works well with cards like Cyber Angel Ben 10 to summon Brionek from the hand or graveyard, then using Ben 10 to get a search for a fairy. Notable targets are Manju, Archlord Christia, and Vanity's Ruler. No matter what kind of Nekroz deck you're running, you can't go without 3 Bryonics. Our next monster is Nekroz of Gungnir, based off of Gungnir, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. She's a level 7 spellcaster type water ritual monster with 2500 attack and 1700 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using any level 7 monsters. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Gungnir once per turn. The first effect, as a quick effect, you can discard this card, then target one Nekroz monster you control. It cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects this turn. Its second effect, also a quick effect, you can discard one Nekroz card, then target one card on the field, destroy it. She's okay. You typically find her in the more pure builds of Nekroz as a one-of. Some players kept her as a side deck option as well. Level 7 could be a little awkward in the deck, but she's searchable with Preparation of Rites, her removal effect is nice to have, and the protection she provides can be the difference in maintaining advantage over your opponent. You won't be seeing her too much nowadays in modern variants, but she's worth experimenting with if you're going for a more pure build. Next up is Nekroz of Valkyrius, based on Fabled Valkyrius. He's a level 8 spellcaster type water ritual monster with 2900 attack and 1700 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using any level 8 monsters. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Valkyrius once per turn. First effect, when your opponent's monster declares an attack, you can banish one Nekroz card from your graveyard and discard this card. Negate the attack, then end the battle phase. The second effect, during your main phase, you contribute up to 2 monsters from your hand and or field, and if you do, draw the same number of cards you tributed. Valkyrius is excellent. He provides battle protection, draw power by tributing from the field and the hand, and will trigger the effects of cards like Shuret and Sorcerer to net you an additional search. Ratios vary depending upon the build, so it's worth experimenting with. I typically like to run him at 2 in a more pure focused build, but you'll find topping deck lists that vary from not running him at all to main decking 3 copies. I have a few deck lists at the end of the video to get you started, but try it out for yourself. Either way, he's a solid addition and a great card for the archetype. Next up is Nekroz of Trishula, based on Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. He's a level 9 warrior type water ritual monster with 2700 attack and 2000 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using any level 9 monsters. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Trishula once per turn. First effect, when a card or effect is activated that targets a Nekroz monster or monsters you control, quick effect, you can discard this card, negate the activation. His second effect, when this card is ritual summoned, you can banish exactly 3 of your opponent's cards, 1 each from their hand, field, and graveyard. The card in the hand is chosen at random. Unlike the legendary monster it's based on, Nekroz of Trishula falls a little short. If you don't have a target on the field, hand, and graveyard, the banishing effect won't happen. However, the effect is still solid and it's still non-targeting banishment. Its targeting protection is good, making it useful while it's in the hand as well. Trishula can be bricky, so I wouldn't recommend running him at any more than 2. In any case, it's a truly faithful adaptation. The next monster is Nekroz of Decisive Armor, based off of Ally of Justice Decisive Armor. He's a level 10 dragon type water ritual monster with 3300 attack and 2300 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell card. Must be ritual summoned without using any level 10 monsters and cannot be special summoned by other ways. You can only use each of these effects of Nekroz of Decisive Armor once per turn. The first effect, during either player's turn, you can discard this card, then target one Nekroz monster you control. It gains 1000 attack and defense until the end of the turn. The second effect, you can target one set card your opponent controls, destroy it, and if you do, banish it. Its honest-like effect is the most useful thing about this guy to help some of your weaker rituals to run over your opponent's bigger monsters. It's a nice little surprise when your opponent attacks and you drop this beefcake. Its on-field effect is serviceable. It's not amazing by any stretch, but it's removal and that's always nice. Like some of the other Nekroz monsters, you won't see him too much today, but throwing him in as a one-of really wouldn't hurt and can be nice to give your Nekroz that extra oomph to get over some of your opponent's bigger threats. Now this next monster came out in 2021 in Ghost from the Past and is the newest member of the archetype. Nekroz of Arid Bear, based on Dragunity Knight Arid Bear, is a level 10 warrior type water ritual monster with 3300 attack and 3200 defense with the following effects. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell. Must be ritual summoned without using any level 10 monsters. You can only use each of the effects of Nekroz of Arid Bear once per turn. First effect, you can discard this card, tribute up to 2 Nekroz Nekroz monsters from your hand and or field, and if you do, send that many Nekroz cards from your deck to the graveyard. Second effect, when a monster effect is activated, quick effect, you contribute one monster from your hand or field, negate the activation, and if you do, banish that card. It's interesting to say the least. His first effect works well with things like Sorcerer and Shuret to net you a couple of searches, and his second on-field effect is a solid monster negation. I've been experimenting with him, and I find him more useful in a pure variant as a one-of, but not so much with anything else. His level's a little awkward to work with to get him onto the field, and while the negation is nice on such a beefy body, it's rare when I've found a play where it would have been ideal to have him on the field instead of something like Brionic or Unicorn. I found his discard effect to be more useful than anything else. If you decide to play him, I wouldn't recommend running him any more than one, and only in a more pure variant of the deck. Now for the final ritual monster, Nekroz of Sophia, based off of Sophia, Goddess of Rebirth. She's a level 11 spellcaster type light ritual monster with 3600 attack and 3400 defense, and the following effect. You can ritual summon this card with any Nekroz ritual spell card. It must be ritual summoned from your hand by using 3 monsters you control with different types and cannot be special summoned by other ways. During either player's main phase 1, you can discard this card and 1 Nekroz spell card. Your opponent cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck during this phase. When this card is ritual summoned, you can banish all other cards on the field and in the graveyards. You cannot normal summon or set or special summon other monsters the turn you activate this effect. At first glance, this sounds incredible. However, when you think about it for a few minutes, you start to see some of its flaws. The discard effect sounds really good, restricting your opponent from being able to summon from the extra deck. However, it only restricts them during main phase 1, meaning they can build their board during main phase 2 without restriction. It's hard to justify the -2 to prevent your opponent from summoning during their first main phase. The effect on summon is pretty powerful, and depending on the game state can be devastating. However, the summoning condition to get her onto the field is a real pain in the ass. It also banishes everything on your field and graveyard, so she's going to be the only monster you have on board. She's just a gimmicky boss monster with an effect that sounds good, but it's surprisingly underwhelming considering the investment. Don't run this. We now move on to the spell cards, all 3 of which are ritual spells. These ritual spells are incredibly well designed and set the standard for what a good ritual spell should look like. I'm going to read off all 3 of their effects, then talk about their unique differences afterwards. We'll start with Nekroz Cycle. Its effect, this card can be used to ritual summon any Nekroz ritual monster. Tribute monsters from your hand or field, then ritual summon 1 Nekroz ritual monster from your hand or graveyard, whose level exactly equals the total levels of those monsters. You can only use this effect of Nekroz Cycle once per turn. If you control no monsters, you can banish this card and 1 Nekroz monster from your graveyard. Add 1 Nekroz spell from your deck to your hand. Nekroz Mirror's effect, this card can be used to ritual summon any Nekroz ritual monster. Tribute monsters from your hand or field and or banish Nekroz monsters from your graveyard, then ritual summon 1 Nekroz ritual monster from your hand, whose level exactly equals the total levels of those monsters. You can only use this effect of Nekroz Mirror once per turn. If you control no monsters, you can banish this card and 1 Nekroz monster from your graveyard, add 1 Nekroz spell from your deck to your hand. And finally, Nekroz Kaleidoscope. Its effect, this card can be used to ritual summon any number of Nekroz ritual monsters. Tribute 1 monster from your hand or field, or send 1 monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. Also after that, ritual summon any number of Nekroz monsters whose total levels exactly equal the level of that monster. You can only use this effect of Nekroz Kaleidoscope once per turn. If you control no monsters, you can banish this card and 1 Nekroz monster from your graveyard, add 1 Nekroz spell from your deck to your hand. Nekroz Cycle can ritual summon a Nekroz monster from the graveyard. Nekroz Mirror allows you to banish monster from your graveyard to ritual summon, and Nekroz Kaleidoscope allows you to summon any number of Nekroz ritual monsters from your hand by sending 1 monster from your hand, field, or most notably, your extra deck to the graveyard. Kaleidoscope stands out as arguably the best of the 3. You can send a level 12 monster to summon 2 Brionic, Trishula and Clausulus, 3 Unicorn, or Valkyries and Unicorn. You can do the same with level 11 and 10 monsters, etc. Notable targets to send are Herald of the Arclight to summon Unicorn, which will get you a search for a ritual monster or spell, Elder Entity Intis for Unicorn, which will allow you to destroy 1 card on the field, Wind Pegasus ad Ignister to summon Unicorn Clausulus, which will spin a card back into your opponent's deck, Psyframe Lord Omega to summon 2 Unicorn and recycle a card from the graveyard into the deck or extra deck, Fossil Warrior Skull Knight to summon Brionic or 2 Clausulus to pop a monster your opponent controls, El Shadal Apkalone to summon Brionic or 2 Clausulus to search a Shadal card like Schism if you're running a Shadal engine, Titanic Clad for Dogmatica if you're running a Dogmatica engine, etc. In terms of how many to run of each of these, it varies. Top deck lists use a different amount depending on the build. Like any ritual spell, it can be bricky, so running 3 of any of them is not really recommended. I would recommend starting with 2 of each in a more pure build and making adjustments accordingly depending on how you shape your deck. Here's a few deck lists to get you started. The Megalith variant helps you keep card advantage, and Megalith monsters serve as ritual spells themselves, so it's easy to get Nekroz monsters on board. The Dogmatica variant is fun, but the window package can clash clash with Unicorn. I usually don't put both on the field at the same time, and Winda can be a brutal opening play against some decks that don't have an out. And the pure variant is just ritual good stuff, and it's consistent. And that's the Nekroz archetype. All in all, Nekroz left quite a legacy. I know a lot of people who really didn't care for Nekroz format, and I can somewhat understand that sentiment. It's a brutal deck that was essentially an anti-meta strategy made meta. Konami finally made a ritual deck that could actually go toe-to-toe with the other mechanics like Fusion and Synchro. It was a long time coming, and I'm glad that the mechanic wasn't abandoned. I'm actually a huge fan of ritual decks and the concept behind them. I've been playing Yu-Gi-Oh! On and off since 2003. It's a huge part of my teenage years, and rituals like the Spirit Monsters just kind of stood out to me. They were the underdogs that nobody played with and no one wanted to use. For good reason, of course. They were terrible, with some exceptions. I don't think this will be the last time we see of the Nekroz archetype. With a few good pieces of support, this deck could be a meta contender once again. The cards are still powerful, Unicorn's effect is still a strong floodgate, and the deck is more consistent now than it's ever been. Whatever the future holds for this archetype, I still love it just the same. Thank you so much for watching this video. We're on the road to 300 subscribers, and I would love it if you would join me on that journey. Until next time.